I kind of feel like I should introduce myself. The last 3 weeks I've been away for various reasons. 3 weeks ago I had vertigo. That was fun. And then 2 weeks ago I was with some of our folks down at the seminary for a gathering for St. Vincent de Paul. And last weekend I was at DeWitt at a retreat center with all of our brothers and sisters who are preparing to come into the church. This year at the Easter Vigil we have some 60-some people coming into the church. So nice to be home with the family on a Sunday around the altar. St. Paul says, an obligation has been imposed on me, and woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. Those are the words that have been jumping out at me all week as I've been praying with the scriptures that we just heard. Paul has not only a desire, but a need, we could say, to unleash the gospel, the way Archbishop Vigneron would put it. Where does that need come from? I'd like to look at those words of Paul and that need in the light of 4 persons here today. We might be able to entitle these reflections, "The One Thing Most Necessary to Unleash the Gospel and How to Get It." The first person is a man named Francis. That's an image of St. Francis in the Basilica in Assisi, drawn by a contemporary of his. By almost every single account, no one has ever walked the face of the earth, with the exception of Mary, who more resembled Jesus than that man. Francis is beloved by Catholics, by Protestants, by Muslims, by Buddhists, by agnostics, even by atheists. Unfortunately, for a lot of us, our image of Francis is something like a 13th century hippie, kind of walking around with his head up in the clouds, deeply in love with birds and creation. He used to preach to the birds. That was because the birds listened. Others didn't. We can relate. Don't get me wrong, Francis loved creation, but he loved creation because he saw in creation a manifestation of the beauty and above all the love of God. But more than anything else, Francis was a man who deeply loved Jesus. Wasn't always the case. Francis grew up a wealthy son of a very wealthy family in the hill country of Assisi, which a number of people in the parish I know have had a chance to go to. Francis loved to flaunt his wealth, almost taunt his friends in that regards. He just lived to satisfy his own desires. He loved to party. Some of us might be able to relate to that. His dream when he was growing up was to be a knight, a soldier, and to win fame and reputation, especially to win women by his feats in battle. That's kind of a 13th century version of a young boy growing up aspiring to be the Super Bowl MVP. But eventually, as it does for everybody, the luster of his wealth and the distractions of things lost its hold on Francis. And then out of nowhere one day, really out of nowhere, Francis had an encounter with Jesus that we would describe here as a life-changing encounter. And that encounter not only impacted Francis, it impacted quite literally tens of millions of lives ever since, as Francis continues to impact people today. I want to look at just one life that was greatly impacted by Francis after Francis met Jesus. In 1219, that's the time when Francis lives, the Sultan, that is to say the ruler of Egypt, he issued a reward of a Byzantine gold coin, something of great value, to anybody in his realm who would bring to him the head of a Christian. He did this because he was trying to incentivize his soldiers to get to work and to mobilize others to put an end to a conflict that was going on at the time in Egypt between Christians and between Muslims. Francis heard about this. And with one of his brothers, somehow he crossed the battle lines unarmed, was arrested, badly beaten. For some reason, they didn't kill him. And then somehow he gets presented to the Sultan. And St. Bonaventure, who's one of the first persons to write a biography of St. Francis, he describes what happened next. This is what he says. The Sultan asked them, that's Francis and his friend, by whom and why, and in what capacity they had been sent, and how they got there. Francis replied they had been sent by God, and not by men, to show him and his subjects the way of salvation and proclaim the truth of the gospel message. In other words, he came to talk to them about Jesus. And Bonaventure continues, when the Sultan saw his enthusiasm and his courage, he listened to him willingly and he pressed him to stay with them. There's another author of the same time, he puts it this way. The Sultan was quickly enraptured by Francis's holiness. Francis proceeded to preach the gospel to the Sultan in such a way that he was not offended and did not end Francis's life immediately for blasphemy. The Sultan could see that love flowed out of Francis, and he was astonished by his boldness. The two friars stayed in the Muslim camp for several days, and they departed on peaceful terms. And before they left, the Sultan wanted to lavish upon Francis expensive gifts, but Francis refused because of his vow of poverty, which also left the Sultan speechless, as he was not aware of a man who refused earthly honors. And the encounter profoundly changed the Sultan, who began to treat Christian prisoners differently as a result. This was no hippie discourse. This was no watering down of the gospel. Francis preached what we call here the kerygma to this Muslim ruler. He shared with them about the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus. That's what he went to talk to him about. He didn't talk to him about a set of rules or a code of ethics. He told him about a person that he had come to meet who had changed his life. And he did this knowing that the Sultan could just cut off his head, because it was happening all around Francis at the time in this conflict. And he preached in such a way that the Sultan didn't want him to leave, even though he thought Jesus was a false prophet. He was attracted to the gospel. He was attracted to Francis. There was something about Francis that was just remarkably different. It was so different that after he left, this is what the Sultan said. If all Christians were like him, then it would be worth it to be a Christian. I wonder, do people say that after they've met you and me? Francis caught something. He caught the passion of Jesus. It was alive in his heart. And it made him to be an astoundingly attractive and contagious figure. I think he caught it as the result of a prayer that he offered. A lot of us know that Francis had what are called the stigmata. This is an image in the Basilica in Assisi of Francis receiving this gift from God. Francis had in his hands, in his side, and his feet, they were visible to everybody, the wounds of Jesus. They bled profusely, and they caused him intense pain. But before he received this gift, Francis prayed for something. He asked God to give him something. This is what he asked for. He said, "May I feel in my heart, as much as possible, the same love which inflamed thee, the Son of God, and led thee to suffer thy passion gladly for us sinners." In other words, Francis wanted to know the love that moved God to leave heaven to become one of us, to save us. Francis wanted a new heart, and he got it. And it forever, and I mean forever, changed not just the history of the church, it changed the history of the world. So let's move from Francis to Jesus. Looks like Christmas out. I was hoping spring was coming. Seems like we just took down the trees, and yet we're in this really short window between Christmas and Lent. In case you haven't looked at the calendar, Ash Wednesday is Valentine's Day. Start eating chocolate now. But why did Jesus come? Why did he become a man born of the Virgin Mary? And why did he end his life on this earth by going to the cross and offering it up in a most painful fashion for you and me? And why did he do everything in between those events? The things that we hear about in the gospel today. Why did he want to come and hang out with us? Why did he bother to spend time in our company, to preach, to teach, to heal, to waste time with us? Why would he do all these things? Why did he just stay in heaven? I'll tell you why. Because he wants you. He desires you. I don't know why. I mean, look at us. Who are we to God? And yet God longs for us. God's not some inventor, who's just got bored one day with the angels in heaven and said, I got to come up with something new, and made us. God's not like that at all. God's a lover. God is not loving. You and me very rarely, am loving. God is not loving. God is love. Those are two really different things. And for some reason, he is passionate about you and me and every single person on the face of the earth. And he's inviting us, he's calling us, he wants us to share in, to bask in for all eternity, starting now, his own abundant life and happiness. And knowing him, encountering him, and experiencing his love for us by name, that is the remedy for the illness that hovers over the human race. The thing that Job talks about in the first reading, that sense of drudgery that we can all sooner or later experience, the drudgery that comes from boredom or for feeling unloved or unlovable, from loneliness, and ultimately from death. Because life without love, no matter how many toys you might have, how much money we might have, how many shiny things we might have, life without love is meaningless. Because we weren't made for stuff. We were made for love. And God is love. And so Francis spent his time sharing this love with others and telling them about the fact that Jesus came not only to talk to us about God's love, but to prove it to us by going to the point of laying down his life. And that's the gospel, people. You are, I am, even Father Dave, passionately loved by Jesus. Just want to make sure you're paying attention. Intensely loved by Jesus. That's the gospel. Which brings me back to Paul. Paul, like Francis, caught something. He caught the passion of the Lord in himself, in his heart. And just like Francis, there was a time when Paul was not a saint. Most of us know, perhaps some of us don't though, Paul hated Jesus. I mean, hated Jesus, and he hated those who followed him. He hated us. He thought Christians were wrong about God, and he thought it was his duty to eliminate them. And so he spent his life seeking out, arresting, imprisoning, and then killing Christians, most especially a man named Stephen, who was one of the first deacons and the first martyr of the church. That was his life. Until all of a sudden, on his way to Damascus, to go out and separate more families, to haul off more people into prison, and to kill more Christians, on his way there, he has a life-changing encounter with Jesus, and from that moment on, everything is different for Paul. He gets a new heart. He gets the heart of Jesus alive within him. And after that day, he has one goal in life: to introduce every single person he meets to the one who is love and who alone can remedy the woes that you and I experience in our hearts. That's why, he says in the second reading, an obligation has been imposed on me, and woe to me if I don't preach the gospel. What obligation? The need that he experiences to tell people about the one who's love. Which brings me finally to the fourth person, or if you want to be more precise, the fourth and the fifth person, you and me. Ever since September, Father Dave and myself and all the priests and deacons, we've been trying to just unpack at Mass the Archbishop's letter, Unleash the Gospel, and we will continue to do so in the weeks and months ahead, because this is, as the Archbishop says, part 2 of the history of the Archdiocese of Detroit. But as I keep thinking about the letter and all that the Archbishop's asking us to do, there is, I think, one thing most necessary if you and I are going to unleash the gospel in Plymouth, in Canton, in Northville, in Novi, in Redford, in Dearborn, and all the various communities that the people in this parish come from. The one thing, I think, is simply this: we need new hearts. I don't love like Francis. I don't love like Paul. And I certainly do not love like Jesus. We need to catch what Paul and Francis caught. I need the passion that moved Jesus to leave heaven, to become one of us, to save us from sin and from death and from hell, to take hold of my heart. I need the conviction that the most interesting man in the world is not the little Spanish guy in the Dos Equis commercial that we're going to see in the Super Bowl later. The most interesting man in the world is Jesus, and there isn't a close second. And that every single human heart, everywhere, everyone we meet, no matter what, longs to know him, even if they don't know it yet, because every single human heart is made for and craves and wants infinite and eternal love. And God is love. So how do we get this heart? Well, it doesn't happen by trying harder. It happens here. It happens at Mass. The Mass is no mere ritual. If you and I could only see what God is trying to do in us and through us when he gathers us here around the altar, and then he invites us to approach him and to come forward in communion. When you and I walk down these aisles for communion, you and I put into our bodies, we receive into our bodies the precious blood of Jesus, the same blood which at this moment is rushing through his sacred heart in heaven, where he is pleading and interceding before the Father on my behalf and yours. You and I, when we come to Mass and we come forward for communion, we drink love. That's why the Mass is the supreme encounter with God, which is what we've titled our mission this year. And he gives us this. He wants us to drink his love, first that we would be overwhelmed by it ourselves and experience the care and the concern that he has for us, but then so that we would be sent out from this place, like Francis, like Paul, like all the great saints down through the ages, to tell others about the one that we've met here, the one who for some reason would rather die than live without us. And so given all that, I'd like to offer to the parish a really simple proposal for Lent. I'd like to suggest that you and I, that we all do the same one thing, that we have but one focus in the days that are about to begin, and that every day, on our own behalf and on behalf of every member in the parish, we pray this prayer. Help us, Lord, to experience as much as possible the love that moved you to become man to save us from the drudgery that is life apart from you. And then when we come forward to feast on his precious blood in communion, we do so with great attentiveness, great expectancy, great awareness. And may it happen, people. May God give us these hearts. May we be inebriated with his blood and consumed with the passion that Paul had, and be able to say, like him, an obligation has been imposed on me, and woe to me if I do not preach the gospel.